and basically focused on providing some kind of a clarity to what kind of debates are taking place in Buddhism, but in a more simpler form about this idea called rationality. So, rationality is it sounds very simple, but when you begin to think about the intricate structure of what constitutes the notion rationality, it becomes a bit complex. The general definition, agreed definition of this idea called rationality, generally is spoken of as the use of knowledge to attain a goal. The use of knowledge to attain a goal. So, anybody who uses knowledge to attain a goal is acting in a rational manner and engaging in what is called rationality. Now, when you hear something like this for the first time, it sounds very simple. But the biggest question that one asks is, if rationality is the use of knowledge to attain a goal, what is knowledge? What do we mean by knowledge? Is information knowledge? Is common sense knowledge? Is an imagination knowledge? Is a written text knowledge? Is knowledge knowing something? Is knowledge about understanding? Now, this question of knowledge is where the difficulty will be experienced. Now, the general definition of knowledge, at least in philosophy, is anything that constitutes of three fundamental components. The first is that for you to attain a knowledge, or for you to become knowledgeable, or for you to have a knowledge, the fundamental element required is called a belief. You need beliefs. And human beings have many beliefs. So the necessary condition for anybody who wants to enter the realms of knowledge is to begin with the simple idea that as human beings, we have a brain, we have a mind, we have cognitive processes, we have cognition, and so we have beliefs. Now, beliefs can come from reading, it can come from your family, it can come from societal conditioning, it can come from social conditioning, it can come from image, it can come from anything. It can come from your own experience. So, the primary necessary condition for knowledge is to have a belief. If by any chance we don't have beliefs as human beings, then it's not possible to enter the realms of knowledge. But it is not only belief that is important. This belief must also be true, because there can be many beliefs that are not true. And the qualification of what is true and not true basically works around another framework called justification. So something is true, and if that particular truth is justified by necessary evidence, or the provision of evidence, or the ability to justify that belief that is true, then you have entered the realms of knowledge. So if you look at philosophy, this knowledge is generally defined as justified through belief, a belief that is true, in which you can provide evidence for that belief. Now, the latest debate about knowledge is that it has not ended only with justification. It has entered another realm, and that is called the realm of sensitivity. And not only sensitivity, but the realms of safety and security. To call something a knowledge, to have the capacity for provision of evidence, requires that that evidence that you provide and that knowledge that you engage with must also be sensitive to the reality that you are working that knowledge on. And at the same time, it creates safety and security for people who are engaging in that knowledge process. So now the question of knowledge has become much more complex. Initially in philosophy, it was very simple. It was justified through belief. Now it has entered the realms of safety and security and sensitivity. And some people have even entered the realms of what is generally called the good and the beautiful. Knowledge has to be ethical and aesthetical. So, coming back to the question of rationality, when we use the word and define rationality as the use of knowledge to attain a goal, this concept of knowledge is a very complex idea. Now, as long as this belief that you have, which is true, that can be justified, is sensitive, is safe, is secure, is beautiful, is good, then the use of that kind of a knowledge is a rational act. Now, this does not mean that the usage of a belief to attain a goal is not rational. It is that there is a realm of rationality that is more superior when you use knowledge rather than use beliefs to attain a goal. So if someone asks me, your argument is that the use of knowledge to attain a goal is rationality. What if I argue that the use of belief to attain a goal is rationality? And I will not have an answer to that. I will say that is also probably rational, but not as superior in terms of rationality if you use knowledge. But there will be a question that I will counter ask you. If that belief is true, then it is rational. But if that belief is false, then you have entered the realms of irrationality. Then what you are basically engaging is not a rational act, is not rationality, but an irrational act and an irrational way of thinking. And worse, if that belief which is false, which is irrational, if that belief which is false is unshakable, or what you generally define as fixed, false, unshakable belief, if that belief of yours is a fixed, false, unshakable belief, even if I have provided evidence for you that it is wrong, still you believe it. Even if I have said that that cannot be argued, in a manner that is rational, still you believe. Even if I showed you that that particular belief that you hold is actually not even real, still you believe. Fixed, false, unshakable belief. Then that is called irrationality. So the first point that I think needs to be understood in terms of conceptual clarity is that when we engage with the idea of rationality and the argument that the usage of knowledge allows us to be rational human beings, at the same time not negating that probably beliefs that are true also make you rational. But once you enter the domain of a fixed, false, unshakable belief, and there's a word for that, it's called delusion. If you are delusionary, you have fixed, false, unshakable belief, then you have entered the realms of the irrational. So the first thing that I think is important for anybody who thinks seriously about rationality to begin to actually comprehend these debates, because this is the introductory debate about rationality. Now, this idea of rationality cannot stand alone. It stands because we live in a society in which there is something called reason that we as human beings have a capability or a faculty to engage in. It stems from our cognitive ability. And this cognitive ability generally is the capability of what you generally call the brain. And the frontal lobe is one of the key areas in which, cognition or cognize or recognize begins to occur. And cognition is multiple. Some people use the word fabrication. Thoughts begin to get fabricated in the frontal lobe. Concepts are tied to one and the other, are linked to one and the other. Syntax is constructed, meaning is constructed, meaning is embodied. So all of these cognitive processes that happens in the brain, which we generally call reason, or the capacity of human beings for the faculty of reason, is why rationality exists. Rationality has its premise in the human faculty of reason. It's because we have reason that we can enter the realm, the higher realms of rationality. Now, this reason is there's another debate about reason. What is reason? What do you mean by reason? Now, one of the arguments that people give is that the fact of reason, this existence of reason is possible because of a law. And this law is generally called the law of cause and effect. Because there seems to be a law of cause and effect that permeates the universe and permeates much more clearly with human beings because of the capacity for having a bigger brain. Because of this law of cause and effect, reason is a capacity that we human beings have. So to think about reason is not to think about reason as a concept, but to think about reason as a capacity arising because there exists a law of cause and effect. If you think about a reason as a concept and then try to basically problematize it in order to define it further, you will have a difficulty. Because reason is a faculty that only arises and exists in the light of the law of cause and effect. So the second point, which I think is very critical to understand, is to think deeply about what reason is and why reason is a faculty of the human being, and where does this so-called faculty rest as a premise around the laws of nature. So the second point which I want to mention is that this reason, which is the base and the bedrock of rationality, has its own bedrock, and that bedrock is called the law of cause and effect. Now, if you look at the debates concerning rationality, this is where people basically work their ideas, their thinking, their arguments, their analysis around. Now, the question for us on this particular day, as we sit together as a large sangha, to kind of think deeply about these processes. Because in Buddhism, many of us take rationality very seriously. Many of us value rationality. Because the Buddhist community is not a community that believes on speculation. The Buddhist community is not a community that believes merely on tradition. The Buddhist community is not a community that believes on hearsay. It is not a community that believes because someone told me so, that's why it is correct. The Buddhist community at its very roots is one who seeks the part of rationality in order to understand the world, to live in this world, and to be a good human being in this world. So rationality goes hand in hand with the Buddhist framework. To be irrational in Buddhism is totally out of place, at least theoretically speaking. Now, it doesn't mean that there are no irrational Buddhists, but the Buddhist framework doesn't allow irrationality to operate within its framework. So, for a community that takes rationality very seriously, then we have to go deeper of what this rationality means. Now, in Buddhism, this law of cause and effect is known by another name. It's called the law of the necessary conditions. It has a name, a Pali category for it to identify. It's called the Ida Pakayata. And the Ida Pakayata is generally identified as the this-that conditionality. And the argument is simple. If this arises, that arises. With the cessation of this, that also succeeds. And from a Buddhist lens, this is actually the law of cause and effect, or the law of causality in Buddhism. In Buddhism, there is no cause that produces an effect. Even a cause is in a state of the existence of conditionalities. Because conditionalities exist, a moment of causes arise. Again, because of the conditions of that causes, an effect arise. And the effect, because of the existence of necessary condition, it becomes the cause for a new effect. So we cannot understand cause and effect in a purely scientific deterministic term. That if you hit if you hit a billiard ball, it will go straight. There is a cause and there will be an effect. In Buddhism, this notion of cause is a bit more complex because it is built not on the notion of a cause in the scientific deterministic sense, but as a cause of the existence of necessary conditions. And this necessary condition is rooted around the this that conditionality, which means if something is, it affects something else. And if this which affects succeeds, that also succeeds. And the world is a state of flux and impermanence of the ida pakayata, of this that conditionality. Now, anybody who has gone deep into the laws of causality within Buddhism will realize that it is not simple to explain. You have to really think about it. And the Buddha himself found it very, very difficult to explain, although the Buddha was a great person in explanation. But you have to experience this law. This is not a law you can define verbally in the realms of the externalized reality, the reality outside of us. It is a law to have a direct experience of. Generally, we call that, they use the word vipassana for that. A direct experience of the reality, a direct observation and a direct experience of the reality. It is only when you do that you can begin to really comprehend what the ida pakayata or the law of causality in Buddhism is. So the third point that I want to submit today when we are thinking about causality is that when you look from a Buddhist perspective, the law of cause and effect is not as simple as it is defined in science. It's a bit more complex. And it's very interesting to note that this kind of a debate is also taking place among scientists, but those who are in quantum mechanics, those who are basically getting into the laws that impact the smallest particle, which is supposedly the building blocks of what we experience in this world called matter. So for a long time, people did not go into the quantum world. And they thought that, the laws of cause and effect works in this particular manner. There is a cause, there is an effect, there is a cause and effect, and so on and so forth. There are reactions everywhere. But now that people are beginning to go into quantum mechanics, they're beginning to realize that in that particular realm of the smallest particles, the deeper you go, the more complex the law becomes. It's not so simple that there is a cause and effect. And Buddhism somewhat enters that realm. So this point that I made about how Buddhism conceives the law of cause and effect, and my argument is that it has to be experienced directly. We can discuss in a forum of this kind because many of us are Buddhists, so we know the language of Buddhism. But the proposition that I make here as an argument is that you might know it conceptually, but unless you experience it directly, you can never comprehend that law. And this is the difficulty with the Buddhist framework in that sense. Now, the fourth point, which I think is important. But before I go to the fourth point, let me summarize what I have said till now. I began by talking about rationality and how rationality is being debated. And I made a point that rationality is the use of knowledge to attain a goal. I problematized the notion of knowledge, and I said that knowledge is not so simple. Knowledge requires many other realms and dimensions to be able to make claims that you are knowledgeable. And the three components are beliefs that are true, that can be justified. And the latest debate has entered the realms of aesthetics, the realms of ethics, the realms of security, the realms of safety, and this very critical point of sensitivity. And I think it's important to mention here because some people, they think that knowledge, even if you produce, must stand on its own. It doesn't have to be sensitive to anything around. Now, many people like us who are in Buddhism, we are a little bit careful not to see that knowledge doesn't become arrogant. that you think, yeah, you're knowledgeable, but you don't realize that that knowledge is oppressing somebody else. It's insensitive to the needs of others. It disempowers, it excludes, it oppresses. We have to be careful that knowledge should not be used on those lines. What is the use of a knowledge? And what is the use of being arrogant about the knowledge that oppresses and excludes? Doesn't make any meaning in social life. It can make you a great human being in terms of name and fame. But as a human being, from a Buddhist perspective, a knowledge that is used only for the sake of power to oppress is no knowledge at all. If that knowledge is not sensitive, it doesn't create security, it doesn't create safety, it is not beautiful, it is not good. It doesn't suffice to make arguments that that thing is called knowledge. The second point that I made is that this thing called knowledge, which basically defines the very core of rationality, depends on a bedrock called reason. And reason is the capacity of the human being. And this reason, again, is a big debate. But this reason itself has another bedrock, and that is called the law of cause and effect. The third point I make is this law of cause and effect is a bit complex in Buddhism. It is not so complex in the sciences. If you go to physics, chemistry, biology, it's not very complex. But if you enter Buddhism and try to understand causality in Buddhism, it is a very complex phenomena. And the category that explains or presents itself in the light of the law of causality is called the Ida Pakayata. Now, I've given a certain talks on Ida Pakayata. I not need to dwell too deep here because we don't have the time. So you can go and check some of the videos that we have made from the Sangha to basically explain what is this, that conditionality and the law of causality in Buddhism. Now, the fourth point, which I think is important, is to understand that one of the things that many of us in Buddhism tend to value, and I need not go into the details of the Kalama Sutta and so on and so forth, where the Buddha was supposed to have mentioned to the Kalamas that trust nothing in this world, trust no one in this world, trust no tradition in this world. Don't even trust what your teacher tells you. Don't trust even a sage tells you. Don't trust anybody in this world. If there is somebody you have to trust, it is yourself. Because you have that capacity. And when that which you trust, which is yourself, once you have realized it, then live up to it and see to it that that which you basically, whether it's a statement or whether it's an action, doesn't hurt somebody else. So I need not go into that because many of you are Buddhists, so you know what the Kalama Sutta is. But what I will point here is this point called the Atta Deepa Bhava. Fundamental to the Buddhist practice of rationality is that each and every human being is a light unto themselves. Whether this light unto themselves arises immediately out of the blue, or whether this light arises because of practice. Now, in the Buddhist framework, Atta Deepa Bhava is a practice. It's not an idea to immediately realize. There are some people who realize immediately, but it's a practice, which means we are born in a society in which we are socially conditioned to believe traditions, socially conditioned to believe our teachers, socially conditioned to believe many things. But the Buddha says that until unless we reclaim our mind around the fundamental principles of that we are light unto ourselves, there is no way you can reclaim the freedom of mind, and in that sense, the freedom to be rational human beings. So the fourth point, which I think is very important to kind of somewhat engage with in the theoretical sense, is to understand that this Buddhism conception of the rationality is a practice, and the practice that relies on the self as a knowing being, as a being having capacity for liberation and enlightenment, as a being who has a capacity to actually understand what rationality is. So the fourth point, which I think is important to note, is that when we think from a Buddhist point of view about rationality, it is not a definition to be made for us then to actually embody and understand by heart. It is a persistent act of the practice of a belief or of a reclamation belief is not a good word, for the reclamation of our own sense of who we are as human beings, and practicing this because you know that you yourself have the capacity for enlightenment. You yourself have the capacity for liberation. You yourself have the capacity for nibbana. And that is why you have the capacity for rationality. Now, the last point I want to make before I stop, which I think is important, is that rationality in Buddhism should not make us arrogant. The biggest problem with rationality is sometimes people become very arrogant about it. And if you look at the history of rationality and the debates about rationality, and the best example is science. Some of the people who think they know, they become so arrogant about their knowledge that sometimes, it's very difficult to engage with them. They are so convinced about what they know. Rationality in Buddhism cannot lead you to arrogance. Because in Buddhism, rationality is not superior to the welfare of all in society. I do not want to mention this in a negative manner, but I have seen that rationality in the West, especially the collective West, producing what is called science, has made people very, very arrogant about what they believe and the knowledge that they have. In Buddhism, rationality is only a means. It is not the final goal and the end of life. But it's a means that can only be actually realized and operationalized in the light of the welfare of everybody else. So, in that sense, from a Buddhist perspective, we can define rationality as that in Buddhism, rationality is fundamental, but this rationality is always tempered by the welfare of everybody. It cannot go beyond the welfare. It cannot say that welfare is secondary to the notion of what we understand called a rationality. Now, it's very interesting. If you go to tribal societies, this is the kind of debate. Even in tribal societies, if you go, tribal societies are rational societies. But rationality is tempered by consensus. If everybody who participates in the Sangha does not collectively, through consensus, arrive at what is good for all of us, that rationality is not good enough. In tribal society, just because you're intelligent and you know how to speak, it doesn't mean that you have become, you're the only one that everybody should listen to. Life is not about you. Life is about how everybody is brought into that whole process to a consensus of what is best for everybody, not only for the single individual. So if you go to tribal societies, you see one individual standing up and intelligently talking and speak and all of that. No one likes these kind of people. You can be intelligent. Okay, you can have very good skills of articulation, but still doesn't make any sense. Because if that rationality doesn't serve the purpose of a consensus, tempered by consensus of the good of one and all, the rationality is meaningless. So it is in Buddhism. Rationality is there very much, very valuable in the Buddhist framework. But rationality cannot be over and above the welfare of everybody else. If rationality is used against the welfare, it has become irrational in Buddhism. So these are some few points that I want to kind of throw today. Today is a big day for us. And it's something that as Buddhists, as practicing Buddhists on this very important Buddha Purnima, and this is a day that we celebrate not only the birth, but the birth, the enlightenment, and the death of Buddha. The Buddhist community is one of the few communities in the world that celebrates a single day of everything that the Buddha attained in his 80 years of lifetime. And I think that is important because we are not celebrating the birth of Buddha. We're not celebrating the death of Buddha. We're not celebrating the enlightenment of Buddha. All of the totality of the message of the Buddha is what we are celebrating today. So it's not the being that we celebrate. It's the message and the wisdom that the Buddha has shared with all of us. And it has survived for 2,500 years. And in 2023, we sit together as a group in a Sangha to actually decipher and try to learn what this master, this Sakya Muni, this teacher of the Sakya clan, has given to this world. And for people like us who live in a country that is very highly irrational, Buddhism is like a light at the end of the tunnel. Buddhism is that rationality that will free our mind. Buddhism is that rationality that will emancipate our mind. Buddhism is that rationality in which we can reclaim our mind. So this is an important day, not for anything else. If one was to leave today's Sangha, it's not because you have learned anything new or you have come to participate in a gathering of Buddhists. It's simply to carry one message that the Buddha gave, and that is that you are the master of yourself. In you is embodied enlightenment. And one of the most beautiful, valuable thing of Buddhism called rationality is already there in you. Don't believe anybody for the sake of belief. Don't trust anybody for the sake of trust. Don't worship and submit to any power, whether it's a God or not a God. You believe in yourself, and in that self, you will find freedom. This is the message of the Buddha today, and I would like to end with these words. Thank you so much.